SharePoint 2013 workflows. In SharePoint 2013, workflows are little different from that of SharePoint 2010. In SharePoint 2013, workflows are built on Windows Workflow Foundation. We call it as WWF. Of course, it comes with .NET Framework 4.5. And this .NET Framework 4.5 Windows Workflow Foundation is further dependent on a separate software called as Windows Workflow Manager. Right now the version is 1.0. Workflow Manager provides the capability to host workflows in high scale, high density and multi-tenant environment. That is a major advantage why Microsoft is now using Workflow Manager for managing the workflow. So how does it all work? See, actually when you install SharePoint 2010, we will have a workflow engine built into it, and that is the one which will take care of managing all our workflows. In SharePoint 2013 also we have got a built-in workflow engine which in turn will take care of communication with the database managed by SQL Server, something like your content database or any other database, and uses that workflow framework as it is in 2013 also. That means whatever was possible in 2010 is as well possible in 2013, and the workflows which were originally developed in SharePoint 2010 would as it is work even in SharePoint 2013 because of the workflow engine built in here also. What is extra is SharePoint 2013 can also depend on this workflow manager which will have its own database, and workflow manager will have its own bus service. Workflow manager depends on a separate bus service which completely remains transparent to us. And one very important point, workflow manager is supported only by SharePoint Standard Edition or Enterprise Edition. It is not supported by the free SharePoint Foundation server. SharePoint 2013 is the first customer to consume Workflow Manager, but it does not mean that it will be the only consumer. We can have other applications developed also using Visual Studio which can make use of Workflow Manager for handling our workflows. But yes, right now Microsoft SharePoint Server is the most popular way of consuming the Workflow Manager workflows, SharePoint 2013 workflows. And as I told you earlier, we have .NET Framework 4.5 over which Windows Workflow Foundation framework is built in. And over and above that, we have got Workflow Manager. SharePoint 2013 server is going to make use of the Workflow Manager infrastructure for working with the workflows. So first and most important thing is we will have to install Workflow Manager. So go to this installation link and you'll have to download the required software from that location for Workflow Manager. And you see here at the bottom, we have Workflow Manager exe. Workflow Manager. This exe you will have to execute. This is web installation. It's a very small exe file which will further pull the content from the server. And then you have Workflow Manager. On my machine it is already installed. Whereas in your case, yes, you will get the list of options which have to be installed. Just keep selecting the default option and say finish, and you will have a Workflow Manager successfully installed on your machine. Workflow Manager configuration will come after successful installation. Right now, because I already have Workflow Manager, it is giving me the option of leave Workflow Manager. So basically it is two steps. Once you have to install the Workflow Manager, and then you have to make the Workflow Manager join the farm and service bus farm, and then come to SharePoint. See, click the contextual link, configure Workflow Manager using the wizard, pairing with Windows Workflow Manager 1.0 with SharePoint. After that, you will have to run this PowerShell command. Now in this PowerShell command, this is the name of the web application which we want to make use of the workflow, and the workflow host URI. Where is Workflow Manager installed? That location we will have to give here. Now what is the issue? How we will know this port number? If you haven't changed any default settings, that is the default port number. But otherwise you can go to IIS, and here in IIS we can expand the workflow manager site, go to bindings, and here you will have, if you want to use HTTPS for communication, it is 12290, but otherwise if it is HTTP, 12291. So that you have to mention here. This is the first step. This will ensure that it will join the farm. SharePoint 2013 is now connected to the workflow manager farm. Now to prove that everything is right, we should go to central application, and we will have after this SP demo server 8000. You'll have service application, and we will have a workflow management service application proxy. Now what is one very important point to be noted is, when you install workflow manager on the server, it automatically installs workflow manager client on that server. But when you need to install workflow manager client on additional servers, suppose you have SharePoint has multiple servers, then in such case on one server we have installed workflow manager server, then there on that server only, that particular SharePoint server only, workflow manager client automatically gets installed. But on other SharePoint servers within the same SharePoint farm, we will have to ensure that we install explicitly workflow manager client. This has to be explicitly installed. You can go here and download the software and install the same. And then you have to activate workflow can use app permissions. This allows workflow to read from and write to add items in the site. This permissions you will have to give to the workflow. It's a site feature. That means you have to go to the SharePoint site, site collection, not site collection, it's just a site feature actually. Site settings, site feature, workflow can use app permissions. This feature you may have to activate it. Allow workflow to read from and write to all items in this site. You may have to give that permission. And now we are ready for workflow to be used in SharePoint. So yes, now we can say that we have got our machine or SharePoint environment successfully configured for building SharePoint 2013 workflow. Now how to also verify? Go to SharePoint Designer. In SharePoint Designer, when we create a workflow, and if suppose we do not have workflow manager installed or SharePoint not properly configured to use workflow manager, in such case when you go to a workflow here and click on, let's say, any new workflow, list workflow on some item, here we will not have SharePoint 2013 workflow. We would have only SharePoint 2010 workflow. By default, the default installation of SharePoint and SharePoint Designer supports only SharePoint 2010. Only after installation of Windows Manager, Workflow Manager, and running the PowerShell commands appropriately, we would have this extra option. And that is what we are going to use for development of SharePoint 2013 workflows. Thank you.